Guys, I tried to tell you in real time that this was probably going to be a bad idea, and it probably didn't make sense, and there was probably really good reasons that we could identify in real time that was telling you it was going to be a bad idea, that Alexander Volkanovski was going to, on short notice, rematch Islam Makhachev at 294, up a weight class, blah, blah, blah. You know the whole story. I didn't think it was going to go all that great. I mean, just roll the tape. You have to look at a circumstance like this and say, he had surgery after his last fight, which initially did not put him in line for this opportunity. Now, maybe he's healing like Wolverine and he feels good. In fact, I don't think he'd take this if he didn't believe he could win. But how can you look at something like this and say, this is certainly not the best way to get Volk versus Islam to, right? We would have wanted that under better circumstances. And more to the point, just how compromised is Volkanovski going to be, or not at his best, either from injury, cardiovascular conditioning, whatever, that's going to limit his capacity to win. Here's what I'm worried about, BC. I'm worried that Islam might go in there, and because Volkanovski took this in an unprepared state, Islam could win this in a relatively not easy fashion, but compared to the first one, much easier. And then we're like, oh, right, what the hell was the point of that? Folks, the math on this is pretty clear, right? 64% of the time, the guys filling in on short notice or the ladies, they don't win. And they definitely don't win in UFC title fights where they're going up a weight class. But of course, this is easy to understand. None of this is complex. And you might be saying, Luke, what is the point of some kind of dumbass victory lap months and months after this has happened? Who cares? Nobody cares about this, which I would agree. I'm not expecting you to care about old takes that I had, but there was actually 2 new pieces of information that came out this week that is worth reviewing, and it is worth looking at, which is why I'm making this video here today. Let's get started on this. The 2 pieces of information that I am referring to is, one, Alexander Volkanovski went on the Freestyle Bender channel. That's, of course, the YouTube channel of former UFC middleweight champion Israel Adesanya. And on that, he does an interview with one of Izzy's relatives, of course, where he goes and discusses some of the conditions pre-fight that were going on before taking the rematch at 294 against Islam Makhachev. And I quote, "I'm known for being disciplined all year round, 24/7, and I just wasn't that time. I was really disappointed. I was more upset with who I was in the previous months leading up to that. I was drinking every day for like 3 or 4 weeks. Honestly, that's unheard of for me, like every day. I've never, ever done that." So just to review here, we already had all the old analysis, which was, one, Makhachev's case for winning the first fight is actually a little bit stronger in hindsight. I had that one 3-2, but probably more closer to 4-1. I did not think it was very controversial. I did not think it was, yes, it was competitive, but I did not think ultimately the scoring necessarily was all that close. You have that. Now you're taking it on basically 12 days notice or less. You're going up a weight class against either he's the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world or he's number 2 at worst. These are like real bad conditions under which to try to beat someone of that caliber. Forget even just the 64% stat of all UFC fights. In that particular climate, a top pound-for-pound guy, you lost to him on a full camp. Now you have an even smaller camp. And there were people who asked me, couldn't a small camp create the element of surprise? You could never rule that out. But as you saw in general, the math is just not ever going to be on your side. So we already have that as a baseline condition. Now add on top of that it turns out he was drinking heavily in this time. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not really mad at him for drinking heavily. Hello, I spent 20 years of my life doing exactly that. But we're talking about what are the conditions under which you can operate effectively to believe that you could win under just the conditions, even if you had something of a longer camp. But to go up a weight class on short notice against a pound-for-pound level guy, that already requires a little bit of tightrope walking. Now you're doing it on top of that, it turns out, when you're not really in any kind of state to even make effective use of a short camp. God only knows what that kind of stuff does to your body chemistry. For an elite fighter, these things can be really important. Granted, he didn't have to cut as much weight because he was going to 155 versus 145. But to me, this is a hell of a revelation. Now, you couple that with the fact that he had told the media following the loss at 294 that he had, a little bit of ants in the pants and a little bit of anxiety of just sitting around and not doing anything. He needed something to focus on, which is why he wanted to take this fight and get back on the horse. And yes, we've got a camp, we've got a goal, we've got a date. That idleness had caused some issues for him, some mental health issues, which is totally normal. And I definitely applaud him for talking about that in public. But now I'm saying if you're coupling that with the drinking, again, I'm not judging it in any way, shape, or form, but that is not an optimal condition under which to take on a pound-for-pound great, even if you had a full camp. really strange decision making, I think, on competitive grounds to take a fight like that, given now what we know. But there's more. The mastermind of City Kickboxing, Eugene Bareman, this is the coach to all of the guys who are over there. He is not Volkanovski's only coach, but he is part of the larger Volkanovski team, and he gave an interview to an outlet called She Loves the Gloves. This is a phenomenal interview. I will link it in the comments below, and you could take a look there. He goes into many things, some of which I don't even have any time to get into. But there were two basic revelations he made about this fight that I thought were really kind of interesting. One, he adds on to the Volkanovski drinking part. He doesn't mention that, but he does mention he was camping in the woods. And this is unusual because this is a guy where Volkanovski, even if he's not in camp, he's still kind of in the gym. He's still always sort of there as a presence, working on his craft, staying in shape. He wasn't even doing that this time. So it's one thing to be drinking and then kind of hanging out in the gym. No. So let's review one more time. He had been drinking recreationally, let's just say, again, no judgment, but he had been doing that by his own admission. He was not in the gym, which is something he ordinarily is doing even when he's not training. Now it's on basically 11 days notice. Then you have to travel pretty far for it. Then it's up a weight class, and it's against a pound-for-pound great. I mean, the number of difficulties that Volkanovski was willing to overlook in this particular case in order to take this fight is astounding. It's astounding. Knowing all of that, I mean, again, not even knowing the details that he was camping or drinking or any of that stuff, not even knowing that, I didn't think it was a good idea. Adding that in, it is astonishing that he would take a fight like that. I mean, listen to Eugene Bareman. Listen to what he had to say. He gets asked if Ilya wins, is there going to be a narrative about that following the knockout loss to Islam? And Eugene Bareman says, quote, I never really looked at that second Islam fight seriously. I was against Volk taking that fight and was very open about it. He continues, listen, Volkanovski is a great fighter, but you have to maintain some level of rationale. You trained for 12 weeks for the first fight, and yes, there's an argument that you won, but the result was different, right? In the end, the fact is that whatever you did in those 12 weeks wasn't enough to get the win on the judges' scorecards. It's unrealistic to expect that you can deliver better results with a week of preparation, and maybe if the circumstances were different, I'd have a different opinion. He goes on to say that if they had had 3 to 4 weeks, he might have felt differently about it, and I also want to put your mind at ease. He also says that because Volkanovski has a full fight camp, and there was some time that actually ended up happening between 294 and now 298, a little bit more than initially Volkanovski had wanted, that this is all going to really service his interests in that contest. He's not saying there's going to be any lingering effects necessarily from this fight, but he is saying he thought it was a bad idea. Now, there is the part about, well, why did he end up taking this? Are there other broader considerations? This is the only argument you can make in hindsight about whether or not it was worth it for Volkanovski to take. But there's a huge asterisk here as well that I want to talk about in just a second. However, look at what the revelation is here from Eugene Bareman regarding why Volkanovski had a strong incentive, in fact, to take this fight in the end. Bareman is asked about Volkanovski and offers this piece of wisdom, quote, everyone has their own reasons for fighting, but there's one recurring theme. This is how fighters support their families and their future. I'm not sure if this was widely publicized, but Alex did sign a new contract with that last fight. So it wasn't about just getting one big payday. It was about all of his future fights happening with significantly better compensation. So from this point of view, his decision was understandable. These are the only grounds under which you could accept this fight. That's it. This is the only one that's justifiable. On competitive grounds, this is about as unwinnable a fight as a pound-for-pound guy is ever going to find himself in. He handicapped himself in virtually every way he possibly could. And, of course, the results spoke for that. He is never going to perform like that when he has all of the other things working for him under a normal condition. But he gave away all of that for this opportunity. And I know what folks might say, well, you're not going to get another chance to unify. You got to take that opportunity when you can. But in the end, I think, in fact, he did not service his own interest. He didn't just lose out on the opportunity for a future of that. Now, coming short twice, he got head kick KO'd, which sort of really puts an emphasis on it. They're just not going to go to him to do this again, and there could be lasting effects from that heading into the next contest. We don't know that. Eugene Bareman does not seem especially concerned about that for what it's worth, but you are at least running that additional risk. You did not service your interest. The only way in which he was able to service his interest was with this. And let's be clear, this is a big W for Volkanovski. We don't have the terms of it, but I'm sure he made a pretty penny to fight Islam on short notice. He's going to get good money against Ilia Topuria, depending on how the sales go, but at least whatever share he was getting or whatever guaranteed minimum he was going to get, those have probably gone up significantly. And in the event that he loses, he will have that opportunity at a future date to have a higher guaranteed minimum in a non-title fight, if that ends up being what it is. But of course, if not, then he's got this pay-per-view points built into the new contract that's going to really make him rich. But here is the thing that I come back to in all of this that really is kind of interesting. Can you imagine a world, whoever your top pound-for-pound guy is in boxing, maybe you think it's Canelo, I don't think that that's fair, maybe you think it's Bud Crawford, maybe you think it's Naoya Inoue, right? Let's just stick with those two names. Bud Crawford and Naoya Inoue. Can you imagine any scenario where either of those guys are filling in on short notice, up a weight class, to save a promoter, and they get a significantly bigger contract in the process? In other words, that was the mechanism by which they ultimately were able to max out their pay, doing the promotion a solid against your own personal and professional interests. It's unfathomable. It's unfathomable. On the one hand, you have to be happy for Volkanovski that he was able to achieve that. Whatever money is there, that decision helped him get a much bigger share of it. That will mean something to his family long term. That will mean something to him in the short term. It will do lots and lots of good for protecting some of his financial long-term interests. We cannot be upset about that. Nobody is. Certainly not me. However, the manner in which this was offered to him, and this is the way, by the way, most millionaires who are made in the UFC, it's when they do the UFC a solid. Think about Nate Diaz doing it on short notice against Conor McGregor, Chris Lieben doing it on short notice any number of different times, Chris Lytle doing it on short notice. Some of these are bigger, some of these are smaller, but sort of being that guy, Donald Cerrone, showing up whenever he wanted to. This enabled him to get a certain kind of reputation, as well as favoritism to an extent from the promotion, as well as bonuses. There can be ways to do this, but it comes in all of these situations at extraordinary risk to the participants about what they could lose in the process by going through with it. Conor McGregor in a different scenario on the other side of accepting it and what could happen there. Again, those upsets don't happen the majority of the time. 64%, it's the one losing who is filling in on short notice. But nevertheless, both guys are running risks in cases like that. But I'm just talking about a guy who is a pound-for-pound great in the sport. He's either number one or number two heading into that contest with Islam Makhachev. The only way he was really able to maximize it was by accepting an extraordinary and, frankly, profoundly inadvisable level of risk that, to me, competitively, majorly backfired. That was the way in which he was able to enrich himself. And enrich himself he should have done, in the sense that he's deserving of it. Maybe you like that mechanism he did, maybe you don't, but he is deserving. If anybody in the fight game is deserving of being paid well, it is Alexander Volkanovski. He is some of the best, if not the best, that this community has to offer. So it says a lot about the imbalance of power in the industry that a pound-for-pound great had to leverage this moment in time in the way that he did to get the kind of money he's getting. Bud Crawford doesn't have to do that and has never done that. Naoya Inoue doesn't have to do that and has never done that. Canelo Alvarez, maybe you could argue that against Floyd, but he was paid massively in the end, and he didn't suffer the same kind of negative consequences, getting head kick KO'd anyway. Plus, it happened much earlier in his career, not later. In an industry where there are all kinds of problems, but there is a better balance of power, fighters don't do that. They don't do that because they don't have to do that. And we're not talking about any old fighters. We're talking about Naoya Inoue. We're talking about Bud Crawford. And I'm not saying he's number 3, but we're talking about guys like Canelo Alvarez. Pound-for-pound greats don't have to accept that kind of risk in those particular kinds of ways that are insanely risky to get maximum contracts. It doesn't work that way over there at all. So what's the lesson here? In the end, the financial big W that Volkanovski got gives me some hope. And if Eugene Bareman says it probably isn't going to affect him all that much, if at all, the head kick KO and everything else heading into the Topuria fight, then great. I'm glad that they put some distance between that. I'm glad he's got a full camp. We all want to see, win or lose, Volkanovski fully ready, fully prepared, ready to go in there and do what he does best. No shortcuts this time, and no shortcomings that were self-imposed. But the lesson is this one. People always like, oh, you always make it about fighter pay, because you can learn so much about the industry studying it and how it works, who gets it, and more importantly, under what circumstances they get it. That can tell you a lot too.